Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. Today we are we're in lesson number 44 of our reading of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. It's our second lesson in the sixth rule, which says, set your house in order before you criticize the world. Last week, we surveyed the chapter just to get an idea of what it was like and then began. Jordan Peterson began by talking about some boys who shot guns at school and killed a bunch of students and then killed themselves. Those boys hated being, according to Jordan Peterson. People who think such things view being itself as inequitable and harsh to the point of corruption, and human being in particular as contemptible. They appoint themselves supreme adjudicators of reality and find reality wanting. Jordan Peterson goes on to say that all people, every man, participates in that kind of thinking, the kind of thinking which is as brutal as the mass murderers of the school, whenever they experience injustice, real or imagined, whenever we encounter tragedy or fall prey to the machinations of others, whenever we experience the horror and pain of our own apparently arbitrary limitations, then the temptation to question being and to curse it arises from the darkness. So Jordan Peterson is tapping into the emotion, the sentiment. When a person is suffering, they say, "Why me? Why does life suck? How can a good God allow such suffering?" And this, according to Jordan Peterson, is a universal temptation. Temptation means it's not a good thing, but people fall into it and do it. Then he goes on to concede or to admit that life is very hard. And then what follows is a whole lot of support and explanation and examination of the statement, life is very hard. And we read a little bit of it last week, and we're moving right into more of it this week. So he is expanding on his thesis that life is, in truth, very hard. And he talked about how, as examples of why life is hard, he points out that everyone is destined for pain. Sometimes it's their fault, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it seems to be just or fair because the person brought on the pain by their own stupid or immoral actions. But other times, the pain seems to be not their fault and not something they could have avoided, avoided by some choice or action. So the question arises, whose fault is it when bad things happen to good people? Whose fault is it? That's where we begin today. And remember, he is examining the topic in depth, so he will look at it from many different perspectives. So he'll begin with this. And I'm going to read all the way to the end of the section. So just listen, follow along, see if you can get the flow of argument. Okay, the question is, whose fault is it? And it's under the subtitle of Life is Hard. Okay, I will read. People who are very ill, or worse, have a sick child, will inevitably find themselves asking this question: whose fault is it? Whether they are religious believers or not. The same is true of someone who finds his shirt sleeve caught in the gears of a giant bureaucracy, who is suffering through a tax audit, or fighting an interminable lawsuit or divorce. And it's not only the obviously suffering who are tormented by the need to blame someone or something for the intolerable state of their being. At the height of his fame, influence, and creative power, for example, the towering Leo Tolstoy himself began to question the value of human existence. Okay, I am going to make some comments on that before we move on. He asks, who is at fault? And then he talks about people who are ill. Who is at fault? Or if they have a sick child, which hurts you even more, who can I blame? God? The world? Who is at fault? Even if the person is not religious, they may shake their fist at God or at being itself, which means the way life is, the way the world is, the way the cosmos has been laid out. The same is true of someone who finds his shirt sleeve caught in the gears of a giant bureaucracy. So he talked about people who are ill or people whose children are ill. They all say, why me? Then he goes on to say people who are suffering because of the government, or, well, the government through any bureaucracy or a tax audit or a lawsuit or divorce. These are the kinds of human situations which are brought to bear. It may be easier to say, you are to blame to the government or the person you are divorcing or something, but still there is a tendency for people to look at the cosmos, at being itself, and say life sucks. And then he goes on to say, it is not only the obviously suffering who are tormented by the need to blame someone. So these previous examples were people who are clearly suffering, but even people who are not clearly suffering, but they are depressed in their life in general, or they have small problems, will have a tendency to want to blame God or being or the world or somebody or something for even minor suffering. And then he goes on to give an example of this. What he is proving is that this experience of anger toward being, toward the world, the way God made it, and toward God himself, is a universal human experience. And whether you're obviously suffering with bad luck or something, or whether you seem to be doing fine. And his next example is the famous author Leo Tolstoy. And now we're going to read about him. And Tolstoy is a great writer, and he wrote beautiful stuff, and he was, by all accounts, a really great man, a good man. You wouldn't expect him to be anything like those boys who shot the school and were so nihilistic. To look at him, he looked a little bit like a saint, if I'm remembering my history correctly. Maybe I'm remembering wrong, but I think Tolstoy was a great guy. But let's read what he thought. Okay, so at the height of his fame, so this was not a time when Tolstoy was down and out. This is when he was wealthy, successful, celebrated by everybody, famous. At the height of his career, at the height of his fame, influence, and creative power, for example, the towering Leo Tolstoy himself. So he must have been a great man, according to Jordan Peterson, because he describes him as the towering Tolstoy himself. And when you use the word himself, it's to emphasize that you wouldn't expect this guy to do that. He himself did it. It emphasizes the surprising nature of what we're going to say about him. The towering Tolstoy himself began to question the value of human existence. He reasoned this way. My position was terrible. I knew that I could find nothing in the way of rational knowledge except a denial of life. And in faith, I could find nothing except a denial of reason. And this was even more impossible than a denial of life. According to rational knowledge, it followed that life is evil, and people know it. They do not have to live, yet they have lived and they do live, just as I myself had lived, even though I had known for a long time that life is meaningless and evil. Let's reread that a bit. My position was terrible. Remember up here, he says, it is not only the obviously suffering who are tormented by the need to blame someone. The need to blame someone is pictured as a torment, a painful thing. So here he says, my position was terrible. Tolstoy was very upset, very miserable in his experience of this. My position was terrible. I knew that I could find nothing in the way of rational knowledge except a denial of life. So, as he searched reason, he came to the conclusion that life is without value. That was a rational conclusion. And in faith, that would be in religion, and Tolstoy was a very religious Christian. In faith, I could find nothing except a denial of reason. Okay, so reason says life is meaningless, and faith says life is meaningful, but there's no justification for this. Faith is a denial of reason. In fact, faith is irrational. And this was even more impossible than a denial of life. So to deny reason was worse than to deny life. It would be better to accept that life is meaningless and maybe kill yourself than to accept that reason is unreliable and flawed and cannot guide you, because then you're truly lost. According to rational knowledge, it followed that life is evil. And people know it. So people are not ignorant. They are living life even though life is evil. They do not have to live, yet they have lived and they do live, just as I myself had lived, even though I had known for a long time that life is meaningless and evil. I am divorced, and I have spent a lot of time thinking about my marriage and wondering about the experience of my husband during our marriage. How must he have felt? In light of the fact that he ultimately left the marriage, I have to assume that there was a lot of negative stuff that he must have been feeling. And I've often wondered how much came from me. And one thing I have realized is that I expected my husband to be honest and morally upright and to choose what is good and to have the self-discipline to do what is right, basically all the time. And I was very surprised if ever he did anything that I could not respect. Actually, he didn't usually do things that I could not respect. In fact, he was a very upright person, a very moral and a self-controlled person. And I always fully expected that he would do what was right as soon as he knew what it was that he should do. In this case, I think Tolstoy is doing the same thing to human nature that I did to my husband. I'm not saying if it is good or bad, I'm just seeing a parallel. I identify myself with Tolstoy. Tolstoy seems to believe that if someone knows that what they are doing is evil and meaningless, they'll stop doing it. Even if the thing that is evil and meaningless is life itself. He is assuming that an honest, upright, morally consistent person would stop living when they know that living is evil and meaningless. So, when he says, life is evil and people know it, they don't have to live, yet they have lived and do live. That would be like me saying, getting drunk is bad, and my husband knows it, and yet he has gotten drunk and continues to do it. See, I would be shocked if my husband did things he knew was wrong. And Tolstoy is saying, expressing some moral outrage and some shock that people would continue to live as soon as they philosophically understood that life sucks, that life is meaningless, and that it has no value. In English, there's a bit of a difference between saying something is evil and saying something is valueless. Valueless is neutral. You could choose to do something without value, and it wouldn't be morally wrong as long as you were not neglecting a duty in order to do the optional valueless thing. I suspect that this translation isn't great and that the word evil does not mean, I suspect that Tolstoy did not mean that people were being actively evil by living, so much as he was suggesting that life itself, being itself, is full of bad stuff, like innocent people suffering and that sort of thing, I guess. Innocent people suffering is one of the only things I can think of, as well as our own suffering. But I don't think he means morally evil. That's my take. Anyway, I'm not sure. But anyway, he says life is evil, and people know it. They don't have to live. They could commit suicide. And yet, they have lived and do live. They don't commit suicide. Just as I myself, says Tolstoy, had lived, even though I had known for a long time that life is meaningless and evil. By the way, had known, had lived, have lived. This is a tense, a grammatical tense. I can't quite remember the name, but it basically refers to a period of time that is begins and completed in the past. So when you said they had lived, that means persons in the past throughout history have lived, and it is completed in the past. And that's the had lived. No, have lived. And then it said, and they do live. That means now we're in simple present tense, and the do is an emphatic. They actually do live, even now. They live. It's a simple present. Just as I myself in the past have lived, and I live today. Even though I had known, at the time I was living, that life is meaningless and evil. Okay, so, try as he might, Tolstoy could identify only 4 means of escaping from such thoughts. Remember, the thoughts are torturous. He needs to escape from them because they're torturing him. He could only identify 4 escapes from this train of thought. 1 was to retreat into childlike ignorance of the problem. So, in other words, we say in English, ignorance is bliss. But in this case, it would be a willful ignorance that is intellectually dishonest, and an upright person who is being rational cannot be dishonest to himself in that way. So, escape number 1 would be a willful ignorance of what is obvious, that life is bad. Escape number 2 would be to pursue mindless pleasure. Many rich and famous people do that. And then they become very depressed at the end. King Solomon did this and became depressed at the end. I don't think this is a long-term fix. This is a palliative. This is a opiate. This is something that will numb the pain, but not cure it. The third, here's number 3, was continuing to drag out a life that is evil and meaningless, knowing beforehand that nothing can come of it. That is really not an escape at all. Basically, the third escape, or not escape, but way of handling this problem, way of dealing with it, is to simply keep living in spite of it. Tolstoy identified that particular form of escape, this one, number 3, with weakness. The people in this category, this one, number 3, know that death is better, but they do not have the strength to act rationally and quickly put an end to the delusion by killing themselves. So Tolstoy has no respect for weak people who won't even kill themselves when it's plain that that is the only rational response to living in this evil universe. Only the 4th and final mode of escape involved strength and energy. It consists of destroying life once one has realized that life is evil and meaningless. So basically, Tolstoy is saying that those boys who shot the school were behaving bravely and heroically according to their philosophical lights. I don't think he'll end there, but that's what it seems to be saying right now. Tolstoy, hold on. Tolstoy relentlessly followed his thoughts. Only unusually strong and logically consistent people act in this manner. So he is praising these people. The way I might praise my husband if he did something morally heroic, such as knowingly giving his life to save our family, something like that. Only unusually strong and logically consistent people act in this manner. Having realized all the stupidity of the joke that is being played on us by God, by the cosmos, having been played on us, and seeing that the blessings of the dead are greater than those of the living, and that it is better not to exist, they act and put an end to this stupid joke. And they use any means of doing it. A rope around the neck, water, a knife in the heart, a train. Okay, Tolstoy is clearly talking about suicide. He's saying only those who are strong and logically consistent will put an end to it all. Tolstoy wasn't pessimistic enough. The stupidity of the joke being played on us does not merely motivate suicide, it motivates murder. Now, this is Jordan Peterson talking. All right, let's see what's my problem now. Okay, so he wasn't pessimistic enough. It's not just suicide that will result from these thoughts, it's actually murder, mass murder, often followed by suicide. That is a far more effective existential protest. According to Jordan Peterson, this train of thought doesn't just end in hanging yourself, it ends in killing as many people as possible. And also, I want to draw your attention back to the beginning of this article where Jordan Peterson talks about Mephistopheles. Remember Mephistopheles? The devil? His self-description is, I am the spirit who negates, and rightly so, for all that comes to be deserves to perish wretchedly. Hold on. It were better that nothing would begin. Thus everything that your terms sin, destruction, evil, represent. That is my proper element. So Mephistopheles wants to destroy everything. And Jordan Peterson is saying that this sentiment of Mephistopheles is the central element of human destructiveness. So it's not just kill yourself, it's destroy everything as much as you can, as much as possible. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, so Tolstoy wasn't pessimistic enough. It's not just suicide, it's murder that logically flows from this kind of thinking. And by way of example, Jordan Peterson points out that by June of 2016, unbelievable as it may seem, there had been 1,000 mass killings defined as 4 or more people shot in a single incident, excluding the shooter, in the United States in 1,260 days. Hold on. That's one such event on 5 of every 6 days for more than 3 years. I don't know that I believe that. I think that may be a false statistic. I seem to remember hearing this statistic debunked somewhere. I just don't believe it's possible that every 6 days we have 5 mass shootings in America. I don't believe that. But clearly we do have a lot of handgun deaths in the United States, especially in the inner city, many related to drugs, mostly related to drugs. At any rate, his point is that as nihilism, this kind of thinking, has taken root in American society, we have lots of murderers and lots of murder-suicides. Everyone says, we don't understand. But how can we still pretend that? How can we pretend we don't understand? Tolstoy understood more than a century ago. The idea being, we say we don't understand why people are killing each other. But if life itself is so evil and meaningless, it would be hard to understand why they're not killing each other and themselves. Killing each other and themselves is the rational response to the crazy universe that presents itself to our attention. I don't really agree with any of this, and I would love to have an actual discussion with someone about this, but our job here is simply to understand what he's talking about and what he's saying. So, and I think in the end I will agree with Jordan Peterson's conclusions. But for now, the Apostle Paul says that if Christ did not die and was not raised, if Christ was not raised, we, Christians, are of all people most to be pitied. We, Christians, are those who actually have the ignorance is bliss, the escape from nihilism that comes from being ignorant of the fact that the cosmos is evil and meaningless. We actually know and believe that it is meaningful, that it is created by a good God and reflects His goodness at every level, and that there is meaning even ultimately in our suffering. And we have faith and believe that we will understand and glorify God when we see the whole of the plan, of which now we see only a small part. But outside of Christ, this is the inescapable reality for people, that if you have no source of meaning, the suffering in the world will outweigh the good, probably, for almost everyone, because everyone does get old and sick and die eventually. Okay, everyone says we don't understand. How can we pretend that? Tolstoy understood more than a century ago. The ancient authors of the biblical story of Cain and Abel understood as well more than 20 centuries ago. They described murder as the first act of post-Edenic history. And not just murder, but fratricidal murder. Murder not only of someone innocent, but of someone ideal and good. And murder done consciously to spite the creator of the universe. If you do not know the stories of the Bible, you should go and read it. The Old Testament, particularly the book of Genesis, the first book, is filled with stories that Jordan Peterson would consider to be filled with archetypes, archetypical images of events and people that have shaped or that reflect our deepest evolution, he would say. I find very meaningful stories to teach my grandchildren about life there. And one of them is the story of Cain and Abel. I'll tell it to you in very brief. Adam and Eve were the first man and the first woman created perfectly in God's image. They sinned and fell and were basically kicked out of the Garden of Eden. That's what we mean by post-Edenic history. After the garden, after sin. Their eldest son, the firstborn, was named Cain, and their second son was named Abel. And Cain was I want to say he was a shepherd, keeper of flocks, but I'm not 100% sure. And if that's correct, then Abel was a farmer. And one of them was a farmer and one of them was a shepherd when they grew up. And one day they both came intending to bring a sacrifice to God. And God accepted the sacrifice that Abel brought, but rejected Cain. And Cain got really mad about that. And God said to him, "Why has your face fallen? So why are you going, And then God says, just choose what's right and you will be acceptable too. But be careful because sin is crouching at your door, wanting to sift you." I think that is what he said, but I could be mixing two stories. Because Jesus also said something like that to somebody. Anyway, God clearly told Cain to watch out because he was treading on thin ice. And instead of repenting and going and doing better, Cain followed his brother into the fields and killed him and hid the body in the field. That evening or a day or two later, God called Cain and said, "Cain, where's Abel, your brother?" And Cain said, "How should I know? Am I my brother's keeper?" And God said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground that received his blood from your hand. Now you will be an outcast. The earth, which has received your brother's blood from your hand, will never bear fruit for you again." So I guess Cain must have been the farmer. Nothing will grow from you in the future. And you have to go out and wander the world. You're not welcome anymore here. And Cain said, My punishment is too great for me. when people see me, they'll kill me. And God said, I'll put a mark on your forehead so that everybody will know that if anybody kills you, he'll be punished even worse. So a mark was put on Cain's forehead, and it's called, in popular English, the mark of Cain. And it was like a mark of shame, but you weren't allowed to kill him. And he went off and did a bunch of stuff. So that's the story. And it says here, Jordan Peterson is supporting the thesis that nihilistic thinking and anger at being gives birth to murder, and that this is the rational and expected result, the consistent result of this type of thinking. And so he says, Tolstoy understood why people are killing people. The ancient biblical authors understood and wrote the story of Cain and Abel. And then moving on, today's killers tell us the same thing in their own words. Who would dare say that this is not the worm at the core of the apple? The worm at the core of the apple. If you bite an apple and you get a worm, that is an image of desiring something good and pure and then being surprised by toxic bitterness at the core. He is saying that this reality of the perceiving the world as evil and meaningless is the worm at the core of the apple. But we will not listen because the truth cuts too close to the bone. If the truth cuts too close to the bone, that means it's too painful. We will refuse to hear it. We will refuse to hear that being is meaningless and evil, and the noble thing to do is to commit suicide after murdering as many people as possible for their own good, because the benefits of being dead are better than the benefits of being alive. We will refuse to hear that. Even for a mind as profound as that of the celebrated Russian author, Tolstoy, there was no way out. So even Tolstoy couldn't figure out a hole in this logic. How the rest of us manage, when a man of Tolstoy's stature admits defeat, how can the rest of us manage? For years, he, meaning Tolstoy, hid his guns from himself and wouldn't walk with a rope in his hands in case he should hang himself. For years, Tolstoy hid his own guns lest he should shoot himself, and he refused to go for a walk by himself with a rope in his hands because he was afraid he would hang himself. How can a person who is awake avoid outrage at the world? So Tolstoy couldn't get away from the perception that the world is an evil, meaningless place where people who are innocent are hurt. All people are hurt, and that, I don't know if he went so far as to say the creator must be a monster, but that really is the conclusion of many people I know who hold these views. If there is a God, he must be a monster to have created a world like this. Okay, let's stop there. I'm going to recap since we have time. The chapter begins by referencing boys who wrote nihilistic screeds full of hatred of meaning and being, and the desire to kill, 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 which was similar to the attitude of the devil in the tragedy Faust. And then Jordan Peterson says that that type of a sentiment is present in all human beings when they are disappointed with reality or they are suffering. And even people who are not suffering tend to fall into this kind of depressed thinking. Then he goes on to say there's truth in it. Life is tough. And he points out all the ways that people suffer, some through their own fault, some not through their own fault. And then he says, who is to blame? And finally, he points out that everybody wants to know who to blame. And he talks about one of the greatest minds that the human race has ever produced, that of Leo Tolstoy, who understood human nature and who was a good and religious man, and how he himself struggled with this to the extent that he was afraid he would kill himself if he had half a chance. And then he ends with the question, how can any of us live in such an evil world if we are mentally and spiritually awake? So hopefully he'll answer the question next week. See you then.